One of the things that has been really important for the AA and incredibly enjoyable for me personally over the last few years is not to just be sitting here in Bedford Square in London, but actually be traveling to many places where our students and alumni come from. And with so much happening in South and Southeast Asia, I think it's been important for us not to just be, in a sense, exporting architecture to that part of the world, but to be cognizant of what is happening in that part of the world and to learn from the experiences of those locations as part and parcel of the way in which we actually practice here in London or in the West. And I think this reciprocity has been developed through many lectures, discussions, workshops, and so on and so forth that the AA has had in Southeast Asia. During a number of these meetings and events, I've had the good fortune to come across Robert Powell. Even though there's a lot of work, architectural work, that's happening in Southeast Asia, there are very, very few people who actually speak about this work, about the nature of contemporary architecture and about the nature of contemporary Asian or Southeast Asian cities. I think Yeang is another person who's been very actively involved in the discussion of architecture in that part of the world, and indeed William Lim, both of whom who are alumni of the school. But I think it's Robert Powell who has really done most of the research and writing, whether it is on the work of Tangara, on the work that he's done on Singapore, the architecture of a global city, or on the work of Yeang, Rethinking the Skyscraper. I think he's been the one who's really articulated the developments over the last 15 or 20 years and has been also, I think, at the same time, very much committed to the development of architectural education with his responsibilities as a professor in Singapore. So it's a great pleasure that Robert is here tonight to share some of his experiences about transcultural city, urbanism, and all of that developed through the framework, in some sense, of the single-family residence. Please welcome Robert Powell.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and good evening. Thanks for turning out on a pretty blustery evening, and thank you, Mohsen, for inviting me to give this lecture. My lecture will examine the cultural changes in South and Southeast Asia in the last 2 decades through the development of the single-family residence. I first journeyed to Southeast Asia 23 years ago in 1979 as a member of an international team of planners and scientists to set up a 200,000 hectare nature reserve in Sulawesi Tengah in Indonesia. That's just up there. For 5 months, I lived with groups of nomadic tribesmen. The Kayu Maranka, this is, had a little more hair in those days, in the Uiwaja Valley at the head of the Morowali River, and with Bugis fishermen and traders around the Gulf of Teluk Tolo. It was an introduction to the traditional life of Southeast Asia. The vernacular house in tropical Asia is well adapted to the climate, with overhanging eaves, with permeable walls, with underfloor ventilation, and it is built without expending huge quantities of non-renewable resources. You'll see in this house here of the Uwaja that the walls are made of bark, stripped from trees. The floor is made of bamboo split bamboo laid with so that ventilation can come through it. The roof, a simple grass or alang roof, which is renewable, and it keeps out the monsoon rain before the nomadic people move on. The houses of the colonial administrators drew many ideas from the indigenous people. For example, in Singapore, in the mid-19th century, the house of the director of the Botanic Garden was a hybrid of a Tudor cottage and elements borrowed from the Malay house. It's what we call a black and white house, and you can see how it has the overhanging roof of a Malay house, the projecting balconies, and the raised on stilts, and yet it has this black and white timber and timber with plaster infill, which is reminiscent of a Tudor cottage. Curiously, the reverse process also occurred, where kampung, that is village houses of Malays in Malacca, borrowed elements from the Portuguese traders. The colourful steps, often with a little curve on them, were borrowed from these early traders and the colonial power. So here was the beginning of a transcultural architecture. In February 1984, I returned to Asia to teach at the National University of Singapore. A year later, I was asked to edit the proceedings of an Aga Khan seminar held in Bangladesh in 1985, entitled Regionalism in Architecture. The idea of critical regionalism was first introduced by Alexander Zonis and Liam Lefebvre in an essay entitled The Grid and the Pathway in 1981. And the notion of regionalism, a regionalism of resistance, was later advanced by Kenneth Frampton in a 1983 essay Towards a Critical Regionalism. The participants in the Bangladesh seminar included Charles Correa, Geoffrey Bauer, and Kenneth Frampton, and it defined the way that I looked at architecture in Asia for the next decade. I devised a taxonomy of regional responses, which was published as an essay in a monograph of Ken Yeang's work entitled Rethinking the Environmental Filter in 1990. I won't go into this in enormous detail, but it's just the starting point for my research. And it looked at this taxonomy of regionalism, which had historically derivative regionalism, that was vernacularism, and historically transformative regionalism, that is modern regionalism. And then there are various subdivisions of that taxonomy. Conservative regionalism, that is typological design, interpretive regionalism, and conservation, i.e. preservation and restoration, I also put within that historically derivative branch. On the historically transformative branch, I looked at replicative regionalism and abstract regionalism. Now, as I say, it's far too short a time to go into all the details of that, but mainly what I was looking at was, and what to explain that taxonomy, is this end of the taxonomy, say historically derivative regionalism, that's this conservative vernacularism. The form was normally used a traditional vernacular typology. The mode of production is usually indigenous craftsmen or master masons. The client or user is the indigenous population, and the materials are traditional materials. At the other end of the taxonomy, that is abstract regionalism, the form is often a hybrid or a hybrid modern regionalism, an abstraction or translation of cultural patterns, and the mode of production is invariably an architect using a contractor. The client is often for a contemporary function. The construction uses high technology, and the materials are modern materials. So there are many variations within that taxonomy, but these are the two extremes, as it were. The idea, in 1998, the Aga Khan held another regional seminar in Zanzibar, East Africa. The procedure of this seminar was published in 1990 as The Architecture of Housing. A paper presented in this seminar by Charles Moore and Hassan Uddin Khan observed that private houses are one of the significant indicators of social change. And in 1991, intrigued by this idea, I embarked on a study of houses in South and Southeast Asia. And that was published in 1993 as The Asian House. Over a period of 10 years, from 1991 till this year, I pursued this research and published 5 other books on houses. The latest was in the series was published in September and entitled The New Thai House. The basic structure of my research grew out of this 1990 taxonomy. And so tonight what I'm going to look at is houses which fall into these rough divisions then. Using vernacular forms and materials, transforming the vernacular, fusing modernity with the vernacular, and finally beyond modernism. Using vernacular forms and materials then. Houses in this category draw upon traditional forms, materials and climatic responses. It is architecture often without architects, usually owner-designed, using traditional materials and built by local craftsmen employed by the house owner. The first house here that I'm showing is the Dachani house in Chiang Rai in Thailand. It was built in 1988 by Tawan Dachani, a well-known Thai artist. Dachani is concerned with retaining traditional skills and techniques, and he uses the traditional form of house and traditional materials. It's a form of the house which is deeply embedded in Thai culture and the animist traditions. As you can see, it uses a tall, it's raised on stilts for underfloor ventilation, protection from animals. It's a tall roof which the interior space aids in ventilation and keeping the interior cool. And the space at the top of the house allows for venting of warm air out to the atmosphere. There are wide verandas and projecting eaves. Here is the main staircase into at the back of the house, or the rear staircase, I should say. You can see it's an attempt to preserve the traditional forms in its purest form. Another house in Laguna in the Philippines is the Tesoro house. This is the house of a dressmaker or a dress designer, Patis Tesoro, who designs, in fact, traditional wedding dresses. But this is a weekend house where she goes away to dream up new designs or and to work on designs. And it's, again, a house that she's designed herself, pacing out the structure and putting pegs in the ground, and then employing a local builder herself, a local craftsman, and who has made a house which is mainly of timber, with walls which are completely porous to allow cross ventilation, and they are made of rattan, woven rattan, and bamboo. Her concern too is to keep alive a tradition and to keep alive the craftsman's work and construction techniques. The house again is open to the environment. I slept in this house for 2 nights. Of course, you need a mosquito net with the proximity of the jungle, but otherwise it's wonderfully ventilated at night, it's cool, the ceiling is high, and you can see that the walls again are quite porous. Another house is this one built by Laki Senanayake, an artist in Sri Lanka. Senanayake has done many of the works of art in Geoffrey Bower's hotels, wonderful sculpture as well as a painter. And this is a house that he built for himself at Dambulla, the geographical centre of Sri Lanka. And he lived here for 10 years, producing his works of art and his sculpture. And he was totally self-reliant, dammed the stream and created a place where he could fish, and all the materials for the house were taken from the surrounding jungle, designed and built by local craftsmen. So that is the one end of the spectrum, if you like, a regionalism which is totally resistant to change, which preserves the local crafts, the local traditions, and almost in its purest form, without substantial change. The next area of the taxonomy was transforming the vernacular, and this involves a transformation of the vernacular house form. One architect in Southeast Asia who has been particularly relevant in this area is Jimmy Lim, located in Kuala Lumpur. And Jimmy bought a house in 1965, an old house, which he has been working on for 25 years. And he uses this house as a sort of an experimental, a bed for experimentation, using different forms of louvers and louvered walls, permeable walls, which he then puts into new houses for his clients. So the method of construction of the house has changed now. It's an architect is involved, there's usually a contractor involved, and there's a transformation in the vernacular. We don't get the pure vernacular architecture being produced. You can see here the various experiments he worked with here, forms of louvers to provide cross ventilation, chick blinds made of bamboo which can be rolled up or dropped down during heavy monsoon rain. Here a seat which is manufactured in such a way that you get ventilation underneath that seat while you're sitting there. And the house has extended eaves so that again you can get cross ventilation but sit shielded from the severe sunlight and from the torrential rain during the monsoon season. This is a house that Jimmy Lim built using the techniques that he developed in his own house, the Salinger House of 1993 at Bangui, it's south of Kuala Lumpur. This was a winner of an Aga Khan Award for architecture. It uses various traditional forms, but without an exact copy of the tradition. You wouldn't, for example, find these sort of triangular forms that you find here. I can just show a plan which might explain that a little better. You see the form of the house is two triangles built with a solid stone core, and then you project the upper floors of the house projecting outwards in this way. It's built in a rubber plantation. This is a traditional meeting space in a Malay house called a serambi. It's where you greet people. There's a hierarchy of privacy. You don't invite people into the main body of the house. They're greeted and offered a drink and so on the serambi. And that seat that Jimmy Lim was experimenting with his own house, you see it reproduced here in the serambi, so that there's a degree of natural ventilation there. It's an architecture without, produced without nails, and it has a wonderful history to it. It took about 6 years to build this house, and started with the selection of 2 huge trees in the forest, and they went for a great traditional way of going out there, selecting the trees, hauling them down out of the jungle, and then bringing them to the site where they were cut with traditional tools. As I say, the house is erected without any nails. It's all with timber joints, and you see here the natural ventilation of bedrooms. This is a sort of dish drying or pot drying element which you find in a traditional kampong house for drying utensils. And it uses, again, natural ventilation with this projecting louvered space here. Another architect who has been instrumental in looking at, in transforming tradition, but using traditional materials, is Bobby Manyosa, a Philippine architect who actually was in London today and just left for the airport about 2 hours ago. And this is a house that Bobby built in Davao in the Philippines. It's called the Floriendo House of 1993. Bobby has been spent much of his architectural career developing traditional materials, how to use bamboo, how to develop the use of bamboo, how to turn the disaster of the Mount Pinatubo volcanic eruption into a opportunity, and by using the volcanic ash and mixing it with cement to make inexpensive blocks. But he's also used bamboo to create plywood. That is now a fairly common material that we can find. The use of rattan and alang-alang and timber and traditional materials used in so many exciting forms here. You see the bamboo walls. You see in the bedroom the use of the anohor leaf. That's a leaf of a palm tree. It's used as a ceiling material. The simple structure, but used all tied together with jungle products taken from the jungle. So that's the Floriendo house. It's on the southern islands of one of the southern islands of the Philippines. Another architect in the Philippines who has been doing a similar sort of work, and I'm actually working with her at the moment at St. Mary's University in Luzon in the Philippines, is Rosario Tan, and this is the Ning Tan house, which experiments with the use of bamboo in the building new architecture, contemporary architecture. Rosario Tan is convinced that unless she lives in a bamboo house, she will never sell the idea of living in a bamboo house to the low-income people. And so she built her own house. It's a sort of, it draws on traditional models of the Bahay Kubo, which is a traditional indigenous house, and the Bahay Nabato, which is a Spanish house of the Philippines. The Spanish first built their houses in stone about 2 to 3 stories high, but found that they didn't survive the earthquakes, and they then resorted to building the ground floor in a masonry material, but the upper floor was usually of timber or bamboo. And this is what Rosario Tan is doing here. She's creating a contemporary house using that model of the Bahay Nabato. Again, there are elements which are taken from the Spanish house, which is a perimeter access corridor. And this is usually where the domestic staff would gain access to the bedroom without having to go up the main staircase. it also offered a space, a ventilated space around the outside of the house. So this is what we're experimenting at the moment with these ways of building with bamboo on contemporary houses with a Japan Asian Foundation grant. One of the one of the most exciting houses that I've experienced in the past few years is this house by Geoffrey Bower. It's called the Cinnamon Hill House, and it almost lays down all the necessary requirements for a house in the tropics. It's Geoffrey would say that when you're designing a house in the tropics, it must firstly not cut down any trees. You move the house rather than move the trees, so that you get trees growing through the bathroom. You get trees growing in the bedroom, and you will move the walls of the house around rather than actually cut these trees down. The main living space is completely open to the sky on two sides, and okay, so the rain comes in, but you move the furniture back, and then when it stops, you move the furniture out again. But this is living in the tropics. One of the other criteria that Geoffrey would say of living in the tropics is you should never use glass in the house. And that's probably a little extreme, but he actually does that in this house. And this is the approach to the house through a path from his own house. This is the view from the house towards the lake. And this is the living room here. As you can see, quite open on two sides to the elements, and no glass in there at all. At the time he built this house, he was building a large hotel with a Japanese contractor at Kandalama, and it was so frustrating having to do drawings and put glass in the hotel that he came home and designed this house just for a sort of outlet for his frustration. But as you can see, trees grow in very close proximity to the house. Some of the trees actually grow through the bathroom roof, as I mentioned. The use of natural materials. An absolutely brilliant house. And here are the windows, which, following his own criteria, there's no glass in the windows. You just close a shutter at night. I think this. I should say that Geoffrey, of course, was an AA graduate. He first trained as a lawyer at Cambridge, and then decided to become an architect at the age of 35. And he came to the, I can't remember what year, but he came to the AA at the age of 35 and graduated as an architect. I gather that there's an exhibition of his work here starting on the 20th of this month, and not to be missed. So yes, just to repeat those, I mean, that's worth saying what the real criteria for a tropical house should be if there were no other restrictions. A living area which is the focus of the house and which is permanently open to the sky. That should not destroy any substantial trees. It should be designed with a minimal use of glazing, not have any gutters. That's important too, because they just fill up with leaves. Be surrounded by non-reflective landscape surfaces, have solid insulating walls on the east and west elevation, wide eaves to provide shade. Then have in-between spaces in the form of verandas, and have tall rooms to create air mass and consequentially thermal insulation. It's not as simple as that, of course. I think when you get into an urban situation in anywhere in Southeast Asia, there's a problem of security, there's a problem of noise, there's a problem of pollution, air pollution, and often an urban tropical house may require that there be internal courts, that there be a sort of duality in the planning arrangement to give openness and accessibility on the inside, with a closed, exclusive appearance on the outside. The air conditioning is necessary. It's in certain rooms in the house, even just to get a good night's sleep, and then to overcome the noise and pollution that there are in many Asian urban centres. But then we shall see some of these developed in some of the other houses I'm going to move on to next. This is a house which, again, transforms the vernacular. It's a house by an Argentinian architect called Ernesto Bedmar. Ernesto has lived for some 20 years in Southeast Asia, first in Hong Kong and then since 1984 in Singapore. And this is a house which draws on various strands of Southeast Asian architecture, but it's a number of pavilions. The entrance to the house feels very much like the entrance to a Chinese house. And when you get through that door to this point here, just like a Chinese house with good feng shui, you don't go straight ahead. You have to turn and move around a courtyard, in this case to your left. And the center courtyard is a dark black pool. So here you come into the entrance there. You begin to move around the house in this sort of clockwise direction, never across the center. Good feng shui. Then the house is a series of pavilions. This is the visitors' pavilion. This is the dining pavilion. This is the living pavilion and sleeping pavilion. And here is a study pavilion at the rear. So this series of pavilions is drawn from other Southeast Asian cultures. This is the living pavilion here, and the shaded veranda way by which you move around the house in a clockwise direction. It has, when one goes into this house, people say visited think immediately of a Balinese house. Others think of a Chinese courtyard house. Others think of a Thai house. But and somehow it encompasses several strands of Southeast Asian tradition and encapsulates them in something which is neither one or the other, but is all at the same time. Here's another house by an Australian architect, Kerry Hill, who you may have heard of. Kerry Hill, again, is an architect who has spent the greater part of his career in Southeast Asia. In 1971, I think he graduated in the University of Western Australia, and then moved to Hong Kong, and then on to Bali, and finally to Singapore, where he set up a practice in 1979. His forte is tourist hotels, but this is a beautiful house that he built in Singapore, the Douglas Wee House, in 1998. And again, it transforms the vernacular architecture. It uses, in fact, almost a Miesian plan. Hardly worth showing this one. I suspect it's difficult to read at this intensity, and certainly from the back of the room. I briefly described it. This is one rectangular block here, and at right angles is another rectangular block. This block contains a guest suite, a dining suite, and servants or domestic staff quarters. And here is the living quarters with a large living room over the top. There are many strands of Southeast Asian architecture embodied in several of these houses. Like, one thing is the idea of a hierarchy of privacy. You rarely in a Asian house go straight into the living room. There's a sort of a greeting room. That's true in the Malay house. It's a sarambi. In a Chinese courtyard house, you wouldn't go straight into the into the family space. It would be a greeting space before you go into that. So many of these houses incorporate that sort of hierarchy of privacy. But this does it in a house which is at the same time, as I say, as a very Miesian plan, and yet the house itself, while exhibiting that sort of very orthogonal plan, also has elements of the tradition in the wide eaves and the projecting roof. The whole of this upper floor can be opened out so that it can be completely naturally ventilated. I want to move on to the next strand then of the taxonomy. This is fusing modernity with vernacular, and houses in this category use modern materials, concrete, glass, steel, aluminium, and they often incorporate Western theoretical constructs, or should I say theoretical constructs that originated in the West. The first house that I will show is the roof house. The family house of Ken Yeang, another AA alumni. Looks a little bit dated now, actually, but looking at Ken's work, more recent work, which is much lighter and uses more steel structure and steel panels and louvers. But his first house, when he went back to Kuala Lumpur, was very much influenced by Corbusier, by the teaching that he then received in the AA and subsequently at Cambridge. It's Corbusian. It's very planar. It's got very planar walls. It's the sort of architecture that he first exhibited in his first high-rise building. But it was certainly an attempt to respond to climate whilst using a modern architecture, a contemporary architecture. Sorry. There's the plan of the house, and there's the section of the house. I think many of you will be familiar with this, but the idea was to build a second house, a second roof, a louvered roof above the flat roof of the house, and thus the name roof house. The idea was that this would filter the sun. It would help to filter the rain. The idea was that the house would also make use of the prevailing winds, which would come in across the pool, and then that by a series of devices, the windows and so would be opened to allow the Venturi effect and for wind to pass through the house. It worked very well in the early days. I visited it shortly after it was completed in 1986, and Ken was a bachelor then, and he could control all these things, and they all work perfectly, and to get natural ventilation. He's got 4 kids now and 2 domestic servants, and his mother lives there, and it doesn't work at all now because they all go around opening and closing things and turn the air conditioning on. But originally it worked incredibly well, and it proved a lot of points about how you can work with climate and make a contemporary house work with climate. Of course, it's magical to this house in the sunlight. It just so many. It's really quite poetic the way the sun strikes the louvers and the shadows that it casts, and it's still poetic today, even though it's looking a little worse for wear. I think Ken would be the first to admit that. Another house which fits within this category of fusing modernity with vernacular is the Reuter House, designed by William Lim. William Lim was an AA alumni, 1953 to 1957. Again, very much affected by the Corbusian ideas that he was taught at that time, time when the Roehampton was being built, time when Bill Howell was teaching here, I think, and much later, this is a house of 1994. William is trying to get an architecture which fuses both the contemporary architecture, traditional architecture, and some of the ideas and modern architecture as well. He's also very, at this time, quite fascinated with some of the ideas of Frank Gehry, and that might seem a little strange in this context, but the idea of fragmentation and twisting geometry. You'll see that the main house is a traditional pavilion, and it's supported on 10 columns, large timber columns. Beneath that is a secondary structure, which is the dining room and the living room, and it actually twists about 10 degrees, and that's in a concrete structure. So you get a concrete structure inside the timber structure, and there's this twist to make the, very geary-like, to make the twist obvious, and that then links to a bedroom block at the rear. This shifting geometry is handled really quite well, and it makes for an intriguing house, which draws its inspiration from both the traditional pavilion in Southeast Asia and from contemporary sources. Another house which is along similar lines is this. Oh, sorry, that's a detail of the Reuter house. With more details. But another house which is somewhat similar in that manner is this house by a young lady architect in Thailand called Kanika Ratanapridakul. Kanika is a graduate of SciArc in California, and she worked for a time with Morphosis. And hers is a very hard-edged, very simple architecture which uses simple materials like cement floors, plastered, rendered walls without paint, timber, tannalized timber, and she produces a contemporary version, a modern version of the Southern Thai Plains house. Now, the Southern Thai Plains house normally is a house raised on stilts, and then it has a number of pavilions on a platform. The pavilions are used for different functions. The parents will have a pavilion, the married eldest son will have a pavilion, grandmother might have a pavilion, and these pavilions are sort of arranged around on a platform. She does a similar thing here. She calls it the U3 house. It's a house which has one pavilion for a mother and father, another pavilion for a sister, and her own pavilion which is above the garage here. And here you see it. That's her pavilion. This is her sister's pavilion, and our parents' pavilion is just to the rear. So it's a very orthogonal house, but it does draw from tradition whilst using a contemporary approach to the house. It uses contemporary materials as well, a profile steel roof, an insulated panel wall, and as I say, otherwise very simple and straightforward use of materials without excessive decoration. This house, the next house, is one in Mahabaleshwar in India. It's called the Marawala House, and it's designed by an architect called Rahul Mehrotra, the son-in-law of Charles Correa, an MIT trained architect who again brings a contemporary approach, a modern approach to building a house in the mountainous, in what used to be, it still is, a sort of retreat from the heat of Bombay. You go up into the hills in the hot season, and what he's done here is to use the laterite walls, which normally are used for field divisions in this in these high hills, and he's used those and integrated them with the terrain to get a house which is wonderfully adapted to the topography. Here you see the house is a single room wide, which enables you to get cross ventilation. Here's the living room. Here is the where are we? Here's a bedroom, another bedroom. I slept in that bedroom for 2 days. And here's the servants' quarters here. As an aside now, you would see that every house that I'm showing has domestic staff quarter. It goes right throughout Asia. There is not a house that I've visited that didn't have domestic staff. And something that I one day want to try and investigate is the invisible wall that is between domestic staff and because somehow the servants can take over the house at one part of the day, then they retreat into their own space at night. But these houses in most cases, cannot run unless they have domestic staff. Something that we don't really have to concern ourselves with designing in houses in the UK or in Western houses. But it's a fundamental part of the design of any house in Asia. Anyway, sorry, back to my what I was saying earlier. This is a house which is about 50 meters long. It spreads out along the slope. It's very much a house which has duality in it. It's got this laterite wall here, and then it's got an openness on the other side, which responds very much, as does a traditional house, to the climate, whilst having a very contemporary approach and a contemporary architectural language. This is a house which most of them will be familiar with. We saw this house in the Indian town of Auroville, south of Chennai. It's the house of a young lady, a graduate of Bombay School of Architecture, and very much influenced by the architecture, I think, of Corbusier and perhaps even of Louis Kahn too. The brick architecture that Kahn, we're familiar with at II, Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad. The use of clay tiles as a permanent formwork for the roof, the sort of brings memories back of the underside of the roof in the Sarabhai house by Corbusier in Ahmedabad. A beautiful house and in every way contemporary, and yet it responds to climate, and it uses traditional small bricks and the craftsmanship of the local workers. She developed other techniques which were quite, or not she, but her colleagues have developed techniques of building which were quite unique. In this ceiling, for example, here the bed was laid, the formwork was laid for the concrete roof to be poured, and then instead of using expensive industrially made pots that we find on building sites all over the world, she actually used some clay pots which had been made had been made in the village. And these are just put down and then reinforcing bars put between them. Concrete is poured, the formwork is stripped, and you get a lovely ceiling made of, you're looking up into a lot of clay pots made in the village. That's the house then of Anupama Kundu, a young architect in Auroville. And here, a house of the Mauli Dasaram house in Colombo, Sri Lanka, shows a architect who is fundamentally concerned with ecology, with recycling, and with sustainability. Every item in this house is recycled, so that the floors of the house are railway sleepers. The walls of the house are doors which have been thrown out, is found on building tips. The structure of the house is acro props, which have been left behind by builders on building sites. And it's a house which incorporates all the sensibilities of the owner, who is also intensely concerned about sustainability and recycling, as well as the architect, Vijita Basanayaka. Here you see how the walls need only be permeable, and so what is used for the house walls is reinforcement, and it simply gives you security, but you don't actually need permanent walls so that the ventilation can circulate through the house. Again, a look at the railway sleepers used as flooring material. The next house is the Kwan house, and this is a house designed by an architect called Keng Soon. I did a monograph of Keng Soon's work in 1997, which was actually called Line, Edge and Shade. This is a second cover for the book. We couldn't sell the book when we called it Line, Edge and Shade. No one knew where to put it on the bookshelf, and it somehow found its way onto the bottom shelf. So we had to reprint it, and we took the subtitle Modern Tropical Architecture and made it the title of the book. But Keng Soon has again spent his architectural career, a lifetime, thinking about an architectural language for the tropics. And he's very vehement about his view that in the tropics, an architecture in the tropics it requires a process of unlearning, and that modernism, or Western modernism, a language of plane, of column, of void, of planar surfaces, of solids and of voids, has to be unlearned, and it should be for the tropics a language of line, of edge and shade. And this is a house that demonstrates that as well as anything. It's the Kwan house, which interestingly enough is for the CEO of McDonald's in Asia, and he chose Keng Soon as his architect. It uses horizontal surfaces, the line, to shade the glazed surfaces. It uses the raised undercroft, on stilts, which we found in the traditional house, to make spaces underneath the houses, which are permanently shaded and which are permanently ventilated. So this is a language, as Keng Soon would say, a modern language for the tropics. Another view of the same house. Water is an important element in it. Helps to cool the house and takes advantage of prevailing winds as wind blows across the water and through the house. In the New Asian House, these are two more books in this series of books that I've produced on houses. In the New Asian House, published in 2001, I refer to second-order modernism. It's a phrase coined by Leon van Schaik to describe some recent works which signal a rational approach differing from first-order modernism by the inclusion in the equation of the subjective reality of the designers and the client's imaginative realm. This is then moving into that other part of the final part of the taxonomy, what I call modernism and beyond. It's also evident that that houses in Asia must begin to engage with other aspects, not simply with climate. We've got to consider some of those things that Terence Riley writes about in The Unprivate House, the idea of the changing concept of family. No longer is every family the typical 2 parents and 3 children. I mean, 50% of families outside Asia are single parent, or single families, 1 person living in a house, or 2 people living in a house. And that changes the idea of a house. In Asia, it's somewhat different. Very often, it's a 3-generation family, and very often the parents live with the family. So this again is a different concept of family, which questions the notion of what a house should be. There's also a convergence more and more of work and residence, working from home, and this questions what the brief for a house should be. There's a desire too for privacy and anonymity in the city, but a contradictory desire for display and for recognition. It's what one almost could call the Princess Di syndrome, where people require a sort of privacy sometimes, but they also at the same time desire recognition. And we have to recognize that has an effect on house design. The next house that I want to show you is a house at Coronation Road, Singapore. by a young architect called Transcultural, and this takes the idea of modernism in Asia a little further. Sukian was educated at Yale, very much influenced by the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, but also by De Stijl, and you get this architecture which is very much a architecture of a De Stijl composition, but it does incorporate louvers, ventilated louvers. It incorporates louvers which can move along the face of the house, and it incorporates again shaded spaces with the opportunity for ventilation to come through the house. Another young architect in Singapore is Mok Wei Wei, and I would say this is one of the more important young architects in Asia. This is a house that he completed in the year 2000. It's called the Morley Road House, and this is, in some ways, explains or gives us some idea of what Van Schaik was referring to when he said second-order modernism. Surprisingly, the house was motivated, or the plan of the house was motivated by a Chinese garden in Suzhou. Again, you enter this house, I'm sorry if that's not very clear at the back, but you enter this house through a door in the southwest corner. You again have to do a little move to the left, again good feng shui. You don't go straight in and along the corridor. You move along a corridor to a pavilion here, and then you take now you're moving anti-clockwise. You move to your left. You pass a dining pavilion. Again, you move on to a living pavilion, and move left again, and you come out to an outdoor space just here. The idea again is of moving around the courtyard, not moving on axis through the house. And this idea is specifically taken from this garden in Suzhou, and it's an idea of closed vistas and then opening vistas, closed vistas and compression, expansion, exactly taken from the garden. And you can see here two of the views in that house. This is the pavilion. Here's some of the compression, and in the previous slide, some of the expansion, expanded spaces. There's another house which continues this development of modernism, modern architecture, and yet revolves around a courtyard, internal courtyard in the city of Bangkok. It's the house of Dongrit Bunag, again an AA graduate, and he uses the timber platform, but it is now used as just a surface for a courtyard, but it is an ideal plan for an inner city location. Idea of minimalism, the idea of the courtyard opening out into a garden. In the last decade, the idea of the global city has come into our discourse. The information society and multinational capital are engaged in a dialogue with the locally specific, an interaction that's creating new architectural solutions that mediate the universal with the particular. Here is a house by, I'm finishing, it seems, with quite a number of AA graduates. This is another AA graduate, Kei Tan, or Tan Kei of the practice KNTA Architects, who have offices here in London and in Singapore. It's a Clooney Roadhouse, and the ideas in this house are theoretical ideas about movement, but yet I asked Tan Kei what other inspirations, and he found some inspiration in the work of Mendelssohn. I happened to be writing an article about Bexhill at the time, and I asked for his views, and he said, in fact, he'd got some inspiration for this house from Mendelssohn's work and Shemayev's work down at Bexhill. Another architect, So there's some of the idea of movement. You can possibly feel that in that elevation there, and then there's the curves in the elevation. Another architect in Singapore is Tang Guan Bi, and this is a house that Tang Guan Bi has designed for a film producer in Singapore in 1997. This is really taking ideas from, or rather, doesn't take ideas from, but it bears out some of the ideas in Terence Riley's book about the unprivate house. But here, the house is almost like a stage for a performance. It's completely glazed, although it does have oversailing roofs, and it is, as it were, on view to the neighbours. It is a performance space, and yet there is a certain degree of anonymity because there's bodies of water interposed between the house and its neighbours. Here you see in the house there's also a catwalk, a sort of catwalk that goes across the living room, and it becomes a great space for display during parties. Looks out over the city skyline. There's an interesting juxtaposition of real life and real life in the swimming pool, where there's an underground video room which has a window that looks into the swimming pool, and you can swim down and look through the room and look at the video while people are looking at you swimming around outside. It's highly theoretical stuff, and the final house I wanted to show you is the Dialogue House. This is a house by and yet another two AA graduates, Frank Ling and Pilar Gonzalez Jerez, who practice now in Kuala Lumpur. And this is a house. This is the plan of the house. It's a house built around a central linear courtyard. The intention was to have, it has glazed screens at both ends of the living room. They were intended to be louvers, but in fact the owners now closed them, made them fixed glazing. But an interesting, when I saw this house, it reminded me of a Malay kampung house, strangely enough. All these roofs are like the way that roofs are added to a house in a Malay kampung as the family expands, and you add another little bit onto it. But it's, of course, a completely contemporary house. And in the house itself, there's a little river runs through the middle, or a semblance of a river. It's a pool with a bridge across it. This side is the wife's side of the house. This side is the husband's side of the house. Not all together, but he has a study here, and his wife has a room to play piano here, and pupils come to be taught piano. But it's a dialogue between him and her, between the one side of the house and the other side of the house. And this is Pilar here. This is the interior of the house, which you can see is entirely contemporary. And we've come right to the other end of that taxonomy, right to the other end of that spectrum of approaches to building in Southeast Asia. I would say that even though we've come all this way and it's a completely contemporary house, it still embodies some elements of traditional culture in there. The idea of the oversailing roofs giving shade gives a form to the house. The idea of feng shui, the idea of a space, and I should have shown that in the plan, a greeting space at the front of the house where you're not invited right into the centre of the house immediately. So there is a hierarchy of privacy there. And so underlying that plan, I would maintain that there are still traditional ideas embodied in the contemporary plan. I'm almost ready to end there. In the age of globalization, then, architecture is being produced at the intersection of the global context and the local context. The information revolution, the new structure of virtual space, and multinational capital all have their implications then on architecture in Southeast Asia. The most recent houses indicate a transcultural architecture located spatially between the global and the local. It is evident that the AA is central to much of this ongoing process. Is there any longer a place for the architecture of resistance suggested by Frampton? And maybe we could discuss that. The last two images I have summarize the huge gap that exists in the lived realities in Asia. The houses of the elite, the houses of the poor. But there's much that we can learn from studying both of these ends of the spectrum. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. That was... Hello? Yeah. Thank you very much, Robert. That was a tremendously rich catalogue and a fascinating review of this extraordinary production of houses. And it raises questions which I think are extremely interesting to people in the AA. As you point out, many of the AA alumni are involved now in this process of trying to work out really the relationship between contemporary and modern or after-modernist issues of design with the much deeper language of the cultural and the climatic that must be sort of understood in negotiation. And I think there are very interesting issues there about whether one calls it resistance or whether one calls it negotiation, exactly what the sort of terms of that discussion can be between an architect wanting to find a language that can express issues of change, can express new ways of living, but also wanting to have a language which has a resonance and a meaning within very deep cultures of space and of the understanding of space. I think it's a fascinating area of work. I'm sure there are going to be some very interesting questions coming from the audience, but perhaps just to start with, and it's perhaps not really fair, but you were quite clear on the sort of more practical side that there are, in a way, performance issues about how one can design within these climates and within these conditions, and you listed some of them both in terms of the rural house and the urban house. What seems much more difficult is whether there are any sort of rules of engagement or ways of thinking about the design in terms of a cultural negotiation, rather than, you know, it has to perform in certain ways, and we've learned a lot about sustainability, about climatic things. Whether also there are issues that an architect should be really thinking very hard about in terms of how it should perform in relation to the vernacular, in relation to the culture, or whether one can really take any position along your taxonomy. It doesn't really matter as long as one is engaging in some way. I mean, do you have, in a way, a sort of a position on that in the same way that you have a position on the more technical performance side of things?
I think it varies from country to country as well. You know,
Yes.
I think if in Singapore, it's a very highly urbanized country, and there's very little of the tradition, if any of it.
It's been almost eradicated.
Almost erased altogether. But strangely enough, you do see. I mean, in the house by Mok Wei Wei, for example, what he called you do see an engagement with tradition there. You know, the level of how you move around a house, and culturally, that's important. In Thailand, there's a much closer relationship to traditional architecture. In fact, in both Thailand and Malaysia, you often, just as in India, you often get people, if they live in Bangkok or they live in Kuala Lumpur, don't say I'm from Bangkok. They say I'm from Chiang Mai, or they say. Even though they've lived all their life, like 20 years in Bangkok, they're still from Chiang Mai. And if you live in Kuala Lumpur, you're still from Ipoh or something like that.
The regional,
and you go back there every year. And so there's this connection with the village, the connection with the family, a much closer connection with the culture. Now that means that you can take different positions along that spectrum. You're more likely to find something at the modernist end of the spectrum if you're in Singapore. You're more likely to find something somewhere in the middle if you're in Thailand. Of course, there are that doesn't always follow exactly, but Yeah, you can take almost any position on that spectrum, I think. There are many ways of, there are many forms of regionalism.
Yes.
And I think they're all valid in the particular, seems to me they're all valid in their particular context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any questions from the audience?
A lot of the example is in a single family house, mostly low rise, but do you have any other suggestions regarding the high rise, in possibly in Singapore or Hong Kong, where how would they adopt to the climate and the culture? Because from my experience, the high rises in the modern housing in Hong Kong is really compact and it's high rise, and most of them do not respond to the climate well at all.
Well, some architects have tried, haven't they, to suggest, Yeang being one, suggesting how you might make a tropical high-rise building. There's a recent competition in Singapore for new high-rise building, which actually I thought was quite disappointing, because all it did was to confirm the same models that had been done before. It's immensely difficult in high-rise housing to introduce cultural aspects, to introduce... I worked on one of the entries for this competition in Singapore with Taking Soon, and I thought he came up with some excellent ideas of how it could be incorporated. You know, the idea of we had 8 apartments on each floor, and we missed out one apartment on each floor, moving around, so that you actually got a kilometre. It was a 50-storey high block. You got a kilometre of vertical parkland winding up the building, which were all planted with quite heavily planted. That's one aspect, I suppose. You could get vertical landscape on the building, but it also gave spaces where people could interact in the same way that they could at ground level. I think there's a lot of inertia in this, from housing authorities and so on, to a resistance to trying to incorporate these cultural ideas into high-rise. And it will only come about, perhaps, with continuously bombarding them with ideas and hopefully getting some of it built gradually, with incorporating vertical landscaping, evaporative cooling, water irrigating planting on the outside of buildings. These are, I know these are sort of, they're not tackling the cultural issues. I know that in Singapore, all cultures, Indian, Malay, and Chinese, are all in the same sort of apartment, and sociologists have looked at how actually religious practice adapts to living in high-rise rather than the other way around. You're making them all, each apartment designed for a particular culture. Like in the traditional Malay house, I'm wandering a bit here, sorry, but it's in the traditional Malay house, the kitchen is always at the back, and a woman can approach it, the kitchen, the woman of the house can approach it from the back without going through you can't do that in a high-rise building. But there's a system of going through the living room now where you put a hand like that and you go through like that, and you indicate that you're not going through the room at all. It's sort of I'm here, but I'm not here, sort of thing. There are cultural adaptations to living in high-rise buildings. I don't think I've answered your question very well at all. I haven't I haven't found any apart from some, as I say, one or two unbuilt schemes by Taking Soon, and some attempts at building high-rise by Yeang. I haven't come across many that have tried to adapt, been able to incorporate these sort of cultural things in high-rise buildings. Have you?
No, that's why I'm asking.
Well, I mean, it's not that surprising in a way, because the new form of the high-rise is something that didn't exist before within the vernacular. So, in a way, trying to find a way to bring the vernacular in tends to compromise it immediately. I mean, like the extreme examples of in many of the Japanese high-rise blocks, inside the apartment, you'll have one room which is the tatami room. But it's completely meaningless, really, within the building. You know, but it's sold as a special feature that you can have a tatami room in your completely modernist flat. And that seems to be really a pretty tokenistic response to how one might get a fusion with a completely new form back to some sort of traditional way of living.